we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Patricia Norby, along with René here. I'm going to do a little introduction of Dr. Norby. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota, and it's a specialization in Native American art history and visual culture. And something that I found interesting as well is she has an MFA in printmaking and photography, so she knows all about, she's an artist herself, and can speak to the medium as well. A few years ago, in 2020, the Met appointed Dr. Norby as the Associate Curator of Native American Art, making her the first full-time curator of Native art in the museum's 150-year history. So that's very impressive and timely, or about time is what I'm trying to say. Not timely. So we're excited to have you here today, and bring your perspective and your expertise in the conversation. And on to René. He's a fellow Canadian. I'm also Canadian. He was born in Montreal, Canada, and studied photography and visual art at Concordia University. In his work, René searches for natural compositions. He doesn't do staged photos. It's natural compositions that suggest an implied or hidden narrative, which make his photographs suit our current exhibition, Hidden Stories, very well. It's all about this hidden narratives, stories behind these images. Last year, ACC Art Books published his retrospective. You'll see it in the front table. René Balcer, Seeing As, the retrospective of his work. And René's lectured widely about photography, about writing, at Columbia, at NYU, Harvard. I'm not going to list all of them, but even Central Academy of Fine Arts, CAFA in Beijing. So I'll let the two of you go. I think you have the sort of a plan already, but yeah, I'm excited to hear you talk about it.
Well, Patricia has a plan. I have nothing.
Okay.
So I'll follow her lead.
You're welcome, and we can take some questions at the end.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Thanks so much, René. I'm so
No,
glad
thank
to be
you for
here.
agreeing to do this. Thank you.
And I was so glad that Daniel brought up diaspora, because I want to mention that as a woman of Kudakacha Indian descent, we are a Lenape homelands, and here in New York City, or island of Manhattan, we often talk about the Lenape diaspora. So I think it's important to start with that right away and understand the indigenous presence that is very strong here in this region. And I know you understand the importance of acknowledgement and respect, specifically in regard to working with indigenous communities and partnerships and collaboration. So I'm just really excited to talk about your images, and I thought what we could do is talk about the images in order to give context and also think about the subject matter, but also what you write about so beautifully in your short essays for each of the images about those layers of hidden knowledge or hidden stories, which is so appropriate for this exhibit. I love what you say about, everything is frozen, and so there's so many layers or so many things that are right on top the surface of the land, and yet there are all these other stories that are hidden underneath. And I think that's really spot on when working with indigenous communities, because we often have the impression as we approach communities and build these relationships, which take extensive time, which takes years, that, everyone's so welcoming and everyone's so friendly, and you don't know what you don't know. And they're not going to tell you what you don't know, because there's this privacy, right? There's these barriers. So I want to hear about the images, but also where do those barriers come up for you in your engagement with the Inuit communities, but also where did this start for you? So I think that's an important question. You're French Canadian.
So my first contact with the North, and it's very it's a very childish thing. So my uncle was Minister of Transport in the Canadian government in the 50s, and one of his missions was to build airports in remote communities in the Arctic. And along the way, somebody gifted him a polar bear skin. And so he had it in his house in front of the TV, and when I was little, we would go there on family visits, and I would lie on the polar bear skin, with my head resting on its head, and watching it and just fall asleep wrapped in this polar bear fur. Which I mentioned, and my friend who is from Kinneroo, which is close to this community here, you know, she kind of smiled and laughed, and you know, she put a little emoji next to the, you know, to that text when I mentioned this. And so that was my first impression of the North as a, you know, oh, not a scary polar bear, but a very kind of warm, enveloping thing. And then my next contact was during Expo 67 in Montreal. The Canadian Pavilion was entirely decorated by Inuit and First Nation artists, but principally Inuit, especially Kanujuak Eschewing, who did the Enchanted Owl, which is probably the most well-known work of Inuit art. And so I was 13, and I was just taken by those images. And then over the next 20 years, as in those days, as every Canadian, young Canadian does, they, you know, you go and work in remote parts of Canada, you know, construction for summer jobs, so I did that. And that gave me, you know, other contacts with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and with the North. And as I worked, I went further north, and so again, you know, kind of superficial contact, but then working alongside, you know, First Nations people, Inuit, you know, workers, and you know, and I got to know a few, you know, during the summer, and you know, the first thing that I noticed was what a great sense of humor, you know, and I think living up north, I think you need a sense of humor, because it's pretty harsh. So, and then as I matured, sort of the contacts, you know, became, you know, they were more sporadic, but they got deeper. And then I had occasion to work on a TV series that I created, you know, that never got produced, but it was set in the Canadian Arctic, and that's how I met Akpik, who's here, and who served as a cultural counselor on the show. And so, we developed a really good friendship and deepened my knowledge of Inuit communities. We went up to Resolute together, which is that last one with on this wall, which photographed in Resolute, and we stayed in contact, and you know, so and on other occasions, my wife Carolyn and I organized a art residency with a Chinese artist who's very interested in spiritual subjects, and he had seen our collection of Inuit art in New York, and so he was fascinated, and you know, he wanted to travel up there. He said, I want to meet wizards. Because he was very interested in shamanism in China, in Taoist imagery, and he found, you know, connections between that and Inuit art and Inuit spirituality, so he was interested in going up there. So we took him to the Okormiut, am I pronouncing it right? Okormiut Art Center in Pangerton, and where he did a 6-week art residency. It wasn't the type of art residency where the artist comes to the community, you know, shuts themselves up in a room and just paints and has no contact. He was engaged, and we insisted that, you know, this had to be a two-way street. So he worked with Inuit artists, conceiving artworks together and executing them together, often using native materials, meaning polar bear skins, caribou skins, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so through that, you know, we were in Pangerton, we were in Kingate here, you know, so over the last 3 years. So, anyways, that's how it all unfolded.
Right.
Yes.
I want to stay there for a moment because
Yeah.
I know you brought up the artist's residency that you and Caroline both support. And I think this is so important today, especially, particularly when, you know, one is a collector of Native American art or a curator, but Indigenous art, I should say, I should expand that. And the way that levels of trust are tested, but also built over time. And I remember you sharing a wonderful story about an artist, and it had to do with his skin and the way that he was being tested in his
Yes.
knowledge. And I wondered if you'd feel comfortable
Sure.
sharing that.
So the artist, the Chinese artist Wu Jinyan, whose his specialty is paper cuts, and that just saying paper cuts, actually, you know, sometimes he uses he cuts buffalo skins, etc. He uses, you know, organic materials. So he arrived, and he had told me before, oh, I want to use whale bones, I want to use polar bear skins in the artworks, and so on. Okay, we'll see. And so when he got there, he immediately started, and the two ladies who ran the art center were kind of looking, what is this nut? And you get that a lot up north, is, you know, people size you up.
That's right.
And, you know, they don't jump to a judgment, but they do size you up, and so they were sizing him up, and they got, he's, you know, okay, and then he showed them his art catalog of, you know, works he'd done with buffalo hides and all. And then as they got to it, they were looking at the catalog, they suddenly decided, well, maybe this guy knows what he's doing, so we'll listen to him more. So at some point, one of the ladies said, well, you know, my grandfather or my father gave me a whale boat. Oh, can I have it? And he said, well, what are you going to give me? You know, and he was eating an apple, so he said, well, I'll give you an apple. And she said, I had apples? And he looked at me and said, you're not the first Southerner to come up here. They you know, you're gonna have to work a little harder. And so then they kept talking, and he talked about polar bear skins and everything. So the head of these art centers said, well, you know, 2 hunters came up, you know, about a month or so ago, and they gave us a polar bear skin. I don't know if it's any good, but, you know, maybe I can pull it out, we can take a look at it. So take out this polar bear skin, and it stank, it had started rotting, there was, you know, evidence of insect infestation. So he starts, Wu Jinyan starts looking at it, and he's in there and smelling it, and he's, you know, and he's really getting in, and the two ladies are watching him, and they go, this guy knows what he's doing. And so he comes up and says, you know, this is it's not in good shape, and I don't think, you know, we can use it. So then the same lady says, well, now that I think about it, we might have a second skin. And pulls that one out, and looks at it and says, yeah, this one is good. So there was a process of, you know, of building trust, and also, you know, sizing up the expertise. And so the other thing is, when he arrived, as we're walking through town together, all little kids would come up, other people would say, oh, cousin, you know, and because the Inuit, of course, you know, we know the migration, and they say, oh, cousins, you know, with the Chinese. So actually, they like to they trace it back to the Mongols. So, oh, Genghis Khan, you know, so, oh, we have Genghis Khan coming. So,
that's getting into an area that's a little bit sensitive.
yes, well, that's what I'm just saying.
Depending on which indigenous community you're
Right,
having
this
this
was,
conversation with.
I was only talking about the Inuit, and I don't speak for the Inuit. Like I said, I'm not an expert on the Arctic. I'm just, you know, somebody who went there, and that's it.
Well, I love that you take that position and you step back and you also emphasize that you don't speak for indigenous communities, you don't speak for Inuit people, and yet you've engaged with issues of social justice, climate change. You've been a big supporter of Inuit artists and now indigenous curators as well. And so I know that you've worked extensively to build trust within different communities and work through those layers. And I think even for an indigenous person, gaining access or gaining trust, it's a long process.
Yeah.
It takes years. And so I'm interested to know about each of the images and, you know, what they're about for you personally, but also how they speak to your experience on each of the days that you worked on these images or created them. Because I think that there's something that often doesn't translate from a two-dimensional image to the actual physical experience of time and place, all of your senses being in these spaces. And I'd like to hear about that as we look at each of the images. The one over here is one of my favorites, this water truck image, because I think it captures a typical or ordinary day. And you mentioned, well, I was there during a particular time of the year.
Right, I can only speak for the week we were there. So,
yeah,
you know, usually, I guess what I talk about, well, these images and Inuit communities, I kind of talk about it from the point of view of, well, what's my part in it, or what is, you know, the separate part of this, of the equation, because that's the only thing I can legitimately, you know, speak from. And so, you know, whether it's a climate change issue, well, that's that's on us. We fucked up the climate, and you know, there's relocation of Inuit families in the 50s to, you know, the high Arctic. Yeah, that's on us. It's not on the Inuit. So that I can speak about, you know, from my point of view, because I'm kind of familiar with that. But so this, and you see it. This is called the water truck, which is right here. So this is the community of Kingate. And Kingate is kind of the art center of the Canadian Arctic, certainly the West Baffin part of the Arctic. And most of the Inuit art that you see will have been made in Dorset, in Kingate, in the studios that have been there since the early 50s. But other than these art studio, it's a pretty ordinary looking Inuit community. And somebody, you know, mentioned, oh, is this Greenland? So it's, in many ways, it's a very typical Arctic community. But the issue in this photo, the water comes from a fairly remote lake, and it is pumped with by electric pumps that are use electricity, and then the water is trucked. There's a whole fleet of these water trucks in the town, and each, you know, they crisscross the town all day, delivering water into water tanks out of this may be water or oil, heating oil, I'm not sure which one, but you know, and that's enough for like 2 days worth of water. So every 2 days you get water delivery, and so people are very dependent on the water trucks. So when we were there, one night there was the winds blow like crazy, and they blow every which way, you know, up in the Arctic. You know, you get westerlies, northerlies, all at once, and a lot of microclimates. But anyway, so one night, you know, the wind was gusting up to 90 kilometers an hour, you know, blowing like hell. And then we heard a boom at around 4 in the morning. And, you know, when we got out, we said, oh, all the lights were out. And then we heard the story that a raven, I love ravens, a raven had gotten blown into the wires and short-circuited the electricity, so a transformer blew, and there was no electricity, which, you know, if you were in the South, oh, you know, Con Ed will come and fix it. Well, Kingate doesn't have a Con Ed office, so to get a repair crew, they have to fly in from Iqaluit, which is about an hour and a half flight from, right? So, but because of the high winds, no planes were taking off. So the town was out of electricity. And if you're out of electricity, you're out of water because it can't get pumped. So, you know, so there was kind of water rationing and kind of hope, but the winds did not let up for like 2 or 3 days. And, you know, without power, you know, food that's in freezers melts, you know, it starts to thaw, and it starts to go bad, you can't cook, you know, and anyways, all the usual problems, and you have no water.
Right.
So luckily, the winds died down, and you know, the crew came in, and you know, and then pretty soon the truck started rolling again. But in Kimmermoot, where U is from, their power's been out since October 30th. And, you know, the power outage, and, you know, they're on generators, but that's not gonna last forever. But that's, you know, Pangerton last year had no electricity for like a week or two. And it was in December, so it was very cold. So, you know, it was, you know, state of emergency, and they couldn't fly people in and out. So life is very precarious, even in the, and it's, you know, this whole thing of, you know, electricity and having to pump water, so, you know, that's a trap we kind of, Southerners, sort of the government kind of built for northern communities by aggregating people and kind of sort of cutting them off from, you know, more natural, organic way of living, and making them dependent on some technology which is not reliable, and then not investing enough resources to make it reliable. So
it's kind of an imposed inclusiveness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think I'll go back to the image, but it's a story that is not unfamiliar to indigenous communities.
Yes.
You know, across the Western Hemisphere. The issue of an overabundance of water and the creation of dams that flood out, you know, sacred spaces and traditional cemeteries or traditional villages among indigenous communities, even here in the States. Like, that's an ongoing story here.
Yes.
But also, there's either an overabundance of water or scarcity, like we see with the Diné and Navajo people or Pueblo people. And my area of study, as you know, is in the Southwest, and specifically focusing on the settler artist Georgia O'Keeffe and her relationship with Pueblo people, where she colonized a Pueblo village for over 50 years. And it relates to this in the sense that O'Keeffe imposed her practices of bringing water into this village, where the locals had gathered around a well every day. Every morning they would go down to the well, gather their water for the day, and it was a space where the villagers, the indigenous people, would share stories, tell jokes. It was their connection. And after O'Keeffe moves into the museum, or not museum, sorry, I'm a curator, museum world, moves into the village, she wants indoor plumbing in her
Right.
hacienda. And the city tells her, well, in order to do this, we have to put indoor plumbing throughout the whole village.
Mhm.
And so the narrative is, oh, she did this wonderful thing for everyone, she brought indoor plumbing.
Right.
But the villagers all say, even today, we preferred our well.
Right.
Because we no longer connect
Yeah.
on a day-to-day basis, we're now isolated
Yeah.
within our homes.
Yeah.
And so when I saw this image, it reminded me of that sense of loss, even in those moments where we're doing something that we also can see as, that's well meant, right?
Right.
The intentions are good. And so this image really struck me also in terms of water,
Yeah.
that we depend so much on the water. But this also could be any native reservation. Like this looks so much like so many of the reservations where I've, visited, or a Pueblo, village in New Mexico. And so I really love this image, especially because it captures that, just that moment of a daily occurrence.
Right. Yeah, the sort of law of unintended consequences in the Arctic, for example, where some certain groups came out against the seal hunt, wearing of seal skins, and so killed the man for seal skin, pretty much worldwide. And so suddenly there was an overabundance of seals, and suddenly fishermen, not just local fishermen, but commercial fishermen from the south started, there's a lot of seals, but there's not much fish left. Where are the fish? Well, the seals are eating the fish. So, oh my God, we got it, and the same thing happened just with regular furs. People you can't wear furs, and in the Northwest Territories where indigenous people there depended on trapping and everything to sustain their living, and trap lines and all this, and they were a source of furs for the fur clothing business. So when that ended, all of a sudden lots of northern communities suddenly, we got no market for our furs, but we do own the land, and there's mineral rights, and people want to buy them, and we need income, we need to survive. So they started selling some of the mineral rights, and the exploitation of the mineral rights was far more damaging on the environment than the taking of certain furs or fur-bearing animals. And it was had a greater impact on decimating the population of fur-bearing animals than their subsistence type fur trafficking. So it's a lot of it is ignorance from down here about we want to protect the animals, but they don't consult ancient wisdom and knowledge that know more about the balance of nature than anybody else. So anyways, that's just another chapter in this sad story.
So I want to talk about your practice. Can you talk about your photography, what kind of camera you use, how do you go about composing your imagery? Are you editing in camera, or how do you go about it?
They say the best camera for a picture is the one you have with you. So, in my book, there's some pictures I even took with a BlackBerry, 20 years ago. But the image itself was still good. These were mostly taken with the Sony, and a couple of them were taken with a Canon G10. And my practice, as Dan mentioned, there's nothing staged. It's really just found scenes, but sorry, basically, when I go out with the camera, I'm kind of like, sort of lantern consciousness, like, going, on the lookout for things, and I guess it's just instincts that have developed over the years that, I thought this was a telling, situation, especially the bone with the little berries next to it, so I thought this will be a good image. Same with the saw. I'm still not sure what the saw, why it's there. I have a few theories, and Boo can probably tell me 24 other theories. I think, it's possible somebody had used it during the winter, maybe to saw, some packed snow and then just left it there, or it fell, or somebody was building, maybe there's some plywood on the other side of that rock and somebody was sawing some wood and then just left the saw there for somebody else to use, or who knows?
Well, it's rusty, so it's been there a while.
Yes,
But
yes.
I think with these two images, I love that punctuation of the moment, of
Yeah.
color, and then zeroing in on the both of these. Here, closer, more intimate, looking at the berries. Can you tell us about the berries? 'Cause
They're crowberries.
Yeah.
So they're a little more bitter than blueberries.
Oh, the crowberries are the black ones. Those are actually the blueberries.
They are the blueberries?
Mhm.
Oh, okay, well, see what I know? Nothing.
But everything is, micro up north.
Yeah.
Everything really low on the ground, and you might see some cranberries, the little red berries.
Uh-huh.
They usually cluster in with the blueberries.
And what are these little, they look like tiny little red acorns, but they're leaves that are folded up. There's,
Right? I don't know the English word, but they are they're fatter berries.
Okay,
That grow on those.
and I have no idea what animal this bone is from, whether it's too big to be a rabbit, but I don't know.
How large is the bone
I
itself?
think it's like this, could be a dog.
I love that you focused in on the berries, because here in the US for Anishinaabe people, for instance, berries are so important. They're part of ceremony, berries are eaten at funerals, they're seasonal, they have a seasonal importance and also very symbolic importance as well. For instance, with Ojibwe communities, strawberries are considered sacred and
Right.
they're considered feminine. And so you'll often see strawberries on women's regalia, but they're also part of a puberty ceremony, where a young woman, when she enters puberty, then cannot eat strawberries for 1 year.
Yeah,
And so then there's a celebration after that year and she can eat strawberries again. So berries are so important
Yeah.
and they're just incredibly beautiful. And what I love too is you're touching on issues of sustenance, the environment, all of these things, water scarcity. And I'm wondering about where that environmental interest came about for you. How did that start?
well, since I was very young, we go fishing in northern Quebec with my grandfather, my father, and his uncles. A lot of canoe trips, up in, again, northern Quebec, 10-day canoe trips. Contact at a summer camp, not a computer camp, but actually a real summer camp out in the woods, with a head counselor who's very savvy about climate change, even in the 1960s, so he made us very aware of that, and our relationship with nature. And again, I just say, if you're Canadian, and if you actually take advantage of it, you will have, a pretty close connection with nature. At least, when I grew up. So, just to me, it just felt kind of a natural part of things.
Can we talk about this image?
Yeah, so that one is in Resolute, which is one of the most northernmost Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic. It's about 500 miles from the North Pole. And this was on Canada Day, which is June 1st. And
July.
July 1st, sorry. So the folks in Resolute were having a little, outdoor picnic. So the story of Resolute, in the early 1950s, during the height of the Cold War, Canada and its allies became worried that the Soviets were going to start encroaching on the Canadian Arctic and maybe have a sneak attack from the north. And so the Canadian government decided, well, there was no one really living up in the high Arctic, so the Canadian government decided, well, we have to assert our sovereignty there. We've got to put people up there. So the Canadian government and the RCMP went to northern Quebec, which is about 1,000 miles south of where Resolute is, and through a little strong arming and sweet talking and various lies and misrepresentations, convinced a number of family groups to relocate further north. And they were told, we'll give you all the equipment you need, and if after a year you don't like it, we'll bring you back, no problem. So they took them by boat up to Gries Fjord, right, up in Ellesmere Island, which is even further north than this, and to Resolute in late September, just before things get, the winter really starts, and drop them off on the shore with some pots and pans and maybe enough food for a couple of weeks, and say, see you in the spring. And so the families were not familiar with the migration patterns in these areas. This is on Cornwallis Island. They didn't know where the animals were that they could hunt. They didn't know, they weren't familiar with the currents and the way the ice broke where they were. So going out on the sea ice to hunt for seals was very precarious, very dangerous. And they didn't know about the winds and it was literally, they were dumped on the moon. And so, they struggled to set up camp. And then at some point up in Resolute, and especially in Ellesmere Island further north, is at some point the sun goes down and it doesn't come back up for 40 days, or 2 months, whatever. And so they were stuck in the night. Many starved to death. They were reduced to eating seagull feathers to sustain themselves. There was a couple of people, you all know who Robert Flaherty is? Okay, so he fathered a son with the lead actress of Nanook of the North, and then, of course, he left her, as soon as the film was gonna see it, and he left. That son that Flaherty fathered was part of, he was now a grown man and a hunter. He was part of that group that got relocated there. There was a well-known sculptor who was part of that group who was relocated there. And so while his sculptures were being sold in New York, he was up there like fighting for his life. And while Flaherty was giving lectures still, in the early 50s, his son was up there fighting for his life with his daughter, his little daughter at that point. So anyways, when the spring came, I don't know what percentage of people who, survived in Gries Fjord and in here, but they were ready to go back to northern Quebec. Well, the RCMP, the government and the RCMP said, oh, sorry, there's no going back, you're stuck here. And so the people were left there. And so when we were there on Canada Day, I asked them about this, and they're proud that, first thing, they're proud that they survived and their community has thrived. That's the first thing, but they've never forgotten where they came from. And, so as a result, because they got spread, they have cousins, like, the cousins are everywhere, all through the communities in the north. The other thing is, while I was there, I met this one elder, very cool looking guy with a great pair of shades, who said, we started on the subject of rights and civil rights, and he said, well, and he was, very articulate about civil rights. And said, so where did you learn about civil rights? I said, well, in high school. We had a teacher who came from the South, this black man, who told us that everybody has civil rights. And this was in the 60s, because this guy was probably 70 something. He said, yeah, he said, even Inuit have civil rights. And he taught us all about civil rights. And so we were able to assert our civil rights thanks to this, teacher. And anyways, I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, so this photograph is called Far Away, and sort of talks about these people being left behind and seeing the families that they have left behind, and just being isolated and kind of set adrift, but they survived.
It's such a powerful story, but it's not an unfamiliar one again.
Right.
Like, the story of relocation of indigenous people is something that has occurred across the entire Western Hemisphere, again and again. And here in the States, we know many Native communities were relocated to urban areas and given a bus ticket and dropped off in Chicago or LA or Minneapolis, and just left there to survive after they had, lured them away from the reservation, saying you're gonna have a better life now if you move into the city, but had no concept of urban life or skills that, and so, this is one of the reasons we have this type of legacy that we do have with a number of indigenous communities, but also the reason that we now have urban Indians and thriving, active communities that are very politically engaged, but also communities that are able to exercise their sense of sovereignty outside of reservation spaces or Indian tribal lands, and understanding the different ways that sovereignty is expressed aesthetically or aesthetically, visually, all of these things, through music, through writing. And what's interesting to me is that you're touching on issues of sovereignty, and you're sharing in those stories and understanding what that means to you as a settler, someone from a settler lineage. And I'm just wondering, how do all of these stories and all of these engagements with specifically the Indian community, how have they impacted your day-to-day life, your perspective and your understanding of the world?
It's I don't know if this is a Canadian expression, but it's there's what I use as blah 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 blah, but I could be wrong, and this reminds me that I could be wrong. But any assumption I make, if my family, and I told you this story, so my family on my mother's side came to what is now Canada in 1640, and one of my and you can stop me since you know the story if it's and one of my ancestors was this guy de la Vérendrye, who explored, but mainly went to trade furs with his 3 sons in the 1730s. So they got as far as the Lake of the Woods, and the points west of Lake Superior. And at the time, the French had a fur trading treaty with the 7 council fires. That's the Lakotas, Dakotas, Little Atlas, etc. And for the 7 council fires, it was a very good treaty because they liked trading with the French, because the French gave them, you know, good rifles, good wares, whereas the English gave them old, rusty, broken down rifles. So the 7 council fires, you know, which was an empire building confederacy, we were very interested in maintaining this treaty with the French. Well, one of de la Vérendrye's sons decided to make a little side deal with the Cree Confederacy, which was north of Lake Superior. And I don't know if his father knew about this, but the 7 council fires found out about this. And, you know, the Cree were a competitor, but also they did not want to lose this treaty with the French. So they came across the son and 19 of his companions on an island on the Lake of the Woods, and they made their displeasure known. This son, you know, my ancestor, was killed along with his companions, and using beaver furs, you know, the representatives of the 7 counties made it abundantly clear that you don't break the treaty with us. And of course, you know, and that's how diplomacy was conducted in those days on both sides. You know, so it's not like, oh my God, this was a terrible, you know, thing. This was how diplomacy and messages go. So my other, you know, the father got the message. Okay, you know, we're going to hold to this treaty with the 7 council fires. So I remember telling you that story, and you were like, well, you don't seem upset about it. No, that's history, and that's the way things were then. You know, and it's not like, oh, one group is worse than, you know. I mean, I think one group was certainly worse, but you know, in terms of the diplomacy, and you know, that's how it is. And so, you know, that knowledge to me is, you know, helps me keep things in balance.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So.
I think as people who live in urban spaces, and I have one more question after this, but I want to say, you know, we live in urban spaces, we live in, you know, New York City, here we are in Manhattan, one of the cultural meccas of the world, and we often think of ourselves, I think, not only do we think of ourselves as removed from that, we have the privilege of being, thinking of ourselves as removed from any settler colonial type, you know, situations or relationships, but the reality is that New York, you know, Lower Manhattan was a major fur trade center.
Yeah.
That's why we have Beaver Street.
Yeah.
And this was a mecca of this type, these types of, you know, settler, colonial, and indigenous relationships. In fact, some of the major fur traders from this area who established philanthropy among museums as we know it today, actually learned Oneida and other Haudenosaunee and other indigenous languages so that they could better engage with Native people in order to build their fortunes.
Right.
So there's this really long history here that I think is important for all of us as New Yorkers to understand our own engagement, as you were sharing earlier. And so my final question for you is, you and I know each other not only in terms of our sense of camaraderie as creatives and artists, but also we work together on a curatorial level. I've known you now for several years, and I want to say, and I'm just going to allude to it because I can't, you know, announce it officially, but you and Carolyn are making a wonderfully generous gift to the Met and honoring, you know, as you said, we want to honor your position as the first Indigenous curator, and you know, all these, you know, wonderful moments. It's an incredible gift that it will soon be announced, so stay tuned. But I wonder about what you think of, because you're not the typical collector with whom I engage. You know, you've written for television, you write crime stories, you engage you've engaged on a regular basis with Inuit people and artists, and it's a really interesting relationship that you have, an understanding of yourself. You're not asking me, you know, in this gift that you're giving, I now want my name on a hall here,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
And so you're really interested in supporting Indigenous artists and specifically Inuit artists. And I just want to ask you, from your perspective and your experience, what is the responsibility of collectors and donors?
Collectors.
Who are now engaging with, well, I mean, it's a long tradition of
Yeah.
engaging with BIPOC artists and communities, but there's also a sense of responsibility there, right? And I'm wondering, what is that for you?
Well, because of this history that my family has, and we have much more positive histories, in Quebec between my father's side of the family, who were also they were furriers, and with the First Nations communities in Three Rivers, and they were the first to actually employ them and pay them, and so there was more amicable, but to honor that relationship, to the positive aspects, I always thought, and again, this is not an original thought, is one of the big problems that Indigenous communities face in North America is invisibility. You ask the average American or Canadian, but they don't know, they've never met an Indigenous person, and they don't see how that's relevant to their life, and so, well, the U.S. Constitution is based on the Iroquois Confederacy, the way, etc. So I think anything I can do to increase the visibility of Indigenous communities, through this gift, and I, especially to an organization like the Met, which is visible worldwide, has an impact. And what people can't see or choose to ignore, no change can happen. So, on one of my TV shows, I had as recurring characters Indigenous people, it wasn't a traditional role, it wasn't a historical role, they weren't wearing feathers, they were FBI agents, etc., living in New York City, so anything to me, anything I can do to increase visibility, is a good thing, and it kind of, pays respect to the more positive relationships that my family's had with the Indigenous communities. So.
Well, thank you for all of this. I think it's really interesting that that you're talking about bringing to the foreground Indigenous experiences and knowledge and supporting that, working in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. And I find it fascinating that you're doing so by participating in this exhibit, which is all about hidden stories.
Right.
And so I love that. And I love the contradictions that you pull up aesthetically. So thank you. All right, we're done. Did you want to answer questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, are there
Is
questions?
there any questions? Are there any questions?
Yes.
Will you be also giving an oral history of your family and your connections and relationships
My cousin is doing
with
that.
the donation? Because I
Oh, with
think,
the donation?
because
well,
I
I'm
think
not
that
sure
would
I have-
also
yeah.
help to enlighten visitors to visit your works and your collections.
Okay. Well,
It's just my personal
yes,
opinion.
you can do that.
I'm just a curator.
Yeah. That's a good idea. Yes.
Well, just a note and a question first. The note is that I couldn't help but think when Patricia, you and Renee were talking about the Inuit and the George O'Keeffe story, certainly the Inuits would have been so much better, were so much better 500 years ago, were they not?
Were, what?
Well, their lives were so much better 500 years ago,
Well, I
before all this arrived.
don't know, just, who do you want to?
Yeah,
Don't ask
And before George O'Keefe arrived.
Well, you know, I think contact with any culture can be detrimental, but it can also empower if there is inclusivity and humility at the table, because we are all human beings. That's all
Yeah.
could say.
Okay, the other question was, I love that the resolute, the photograph. You are high up, you're higher than they are. It seems.
Yeah, well, because they were on the gravel shore, and I was just
Right.
up like maybe,
But to me, anyway, it looks as though we're saying goodbye to them, which is exactly what happened.
yes, well,
They were left.
that's a hidden story. You know, the Wittgenstein wrote an essay called Seeing As, which put forth the idea that basically, and he used the famous duck rabbit drawing, depends. So, 50% of people see the duck, the other 50% see the rabbit, and they can never see the. So basically, people see what they want to see in images, and
It's called bistable
yes.
bistable imagery, and actually, we explore that, and sorry, just plug in our current exhibit
okay.
at the Met. Mary Sully was a Dakota artist, and she, during from the 20s to the 40s, and she explored bistable imagery. So pretty much everyone here is probably familiar with Rubens' vase, where
Yes.
you either see the vase or you see the faces. So it's this visual exercise, it's a psychological test, but.
So there you go. Yes.
My wife reminded me of when you told the story of George O'Keefe and also with the water trucks there. There's a project where a local well was affecting people's health, so we built a water system with pipes. And then the difficulty was that, not to say the country, we were finding that the pipes leading to people so they could have water in their homes were being sabotaged. And so over and over again, we had to rebuild the pipe system to provide water for this community. And eventually we found out who was destroying the pipes were the local women. Why? Because they would come to the well in the morning, have these conversations. It led to a community. Now they had to go back to their homes, and it was in a part of the world where they were kept in their homes, which means now that they had the spigots in their homes, they couldn't meet anyone else other than what they knew. And it created this conflict between culture and technology.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if, given that we have this imposition of technology which disturbs culture, but at the same time as it also creates these other types of conflicts at the same time. I was wondering if you would.
Well, I think, you mentioned, I was doing a project in Saudi Arabia about Aramco, and when they started building out a part of Saudi Arabia and Daman, which, had the wells and everything, the same thing happened. The Bedouin women would meet, and, they exchange information at the well, and they really kind of ran the village through these, daily conclaves at the well, and then once running water, they were very unhappy about it. But, there's kind of the opposite phenomenon too, is in the catalog, there's a photograph taken in Fort Simpson, Northwest Territories, of a young boy pointing at a church. And, to me, the photograph references residential schools and that whole horror show. But that town, Fort Simpson, in the 50s, the people who lived there, the Dene people who lived in that town, were mostly, nomadic. They were, nomadics, the wrong but they were trappers. So they lived in very small groups, you know, along the trap lines out in the forest. And then the government decided, you know, it's really hard to keep track of all of you and give you your welfare checks and, you know, whatever we have to. So we're gonna bring you all in. And they brought them all into this island in the middle of the Liard River, where it meets the Mackenzie. So it's an area of like, when the ice breaks, it's like, you know, I mean, it's very dangerous. But anyway, they put them all there. It's, okay, you know, we're gonna build you little houses. And, you know, and so the heating that they had was wood, so they would, you know, they would need to go chop some wood. And within 5 years, you know, there were no trees left on this island. So then the king go, oh, well, I guess we better build them a bridge so they could go onto the mainland and cut some trees. And, you know, and they just created this horrible, and then 3 years ago, the ice breakup backed up, and the whole town was like flooded. Like, you know, so they just created this terrible. Oh, we just need to bring you all into this island, you know. And they were, you know, they were fine, you know, with their, you know, their ancestral way of life, and you know, it's just again more unintended consequences. So.
I think it's interesting that these are women.
Yeah.
But when I looked at this image and then I read about it, what struck me was that in studying Indigenous photography and different practices within Indigenous photography, and I don't know what the situation here, because you mentioned it's a hidden story, but an exercise of sovereignty for many Indigenous people is to turn their back to the camera.
Right.
And that's how I read it. But I'm coming from an Indigenous woman's perspective, looking at this image like.
Well, I took it from there because I have an issue with taking pictures of, you know, even on the street. You know, on the street, I want people to see that I have a camera, and then they can choose to look away or not. And also, you know, I wanted to preserve their privacy and not take a picture of their face where they could be identified. Even the kids are looking away. So that was one of the reasons I was where I was.
Are those telephone poles back? What is that? What are those poles?
Yeah, there's some kind of telephone
I
box
like
or something.
Because I thought,
Maybe, who knows?
I thought perhaps you were saying this is the rejection of technology.
No, this is the feeling of being abandoned, being cut off, and you know, because there's people on the shore, they're kind of walking away on the far shore. So.
One more question. Anyone?
All
Can you talk about this?
right. Okay, so that's the skull of a bowhead whale, and this was photographed just outside of Pangerton. The village is sort of behind you. And so the bowhead whale was hunted by the Inuit community. You know, maybe like the community might take one whale, and that was enough to sustain it as far as you know, whale products. You know, both as food and you know, some Inuit communities use the bones for their shelter. They use the oil for their lamps. You know, for light and warmth. And so this was the practice, you know, for millennia. And then in the 1800s or so, Europeans started, you know, coming up into the Arctic to hunt the bowhead whale. And they came up the sound here, Cumberland Sound, and eventually right into Pangerton, hunting the bowhead. And predictably, you know, what was a subsistence hunt suddenly became a commercial hunt, and by the early 1900s, they almost hunted the bowhead out of existence. And so with the commercial hunters kind of lost interest, the Inuit, and then the government put a ban on hunting bowhead whales, even for Inuit communities. And the bowhead, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, but the bowhead hunt not only had practical purposes, but it was really a community enterprise. And not only capturing and killing the bowhead, but then hauling it onto shore and cutting it up and dividing it among, it would take, even 100 people to, involved in it, but it was a community building and a community affirming event. Well, the government, because the European and other whalers hunted it almost out of existence, the government forbade the hunt even for the Inuit. Miraculously, the bowhead population bounced back even to pre-commercial hunt levels. But by that time, the Inuit had asserted their land claims and had gained control of the self-governing, semi-autonomous, I call it country, of Nunavut, which is the size of Europe, maybe?
Texas?
Texas, no, it's bigger, it's quite big. Well, Texas is almost the size of Europe. And
It's the size of Mexico.
So in asserting their land claims, they also gained, well, we're gonna control now the bowhead whale hunt. And through some system, I don't know if it's lottery or not, but each community at different times, not necessarily every year, for each community, but they can go out and hunt a bowhead whale. And I think in 2018, I think the Pangerton they were out hunting and they got a bowhead whale, and I think this is the skull of it that was brought back and put basically at the entrance of the harbor in Pangerton as we're here. And I quote an Inuk who participated in the first hunt after